The obsidian citadel was built from volcanic glass, iron, and absolute power. And on the morning Grace decided to abandon it forever, it felt sharper than it ever had before. Not because of the black stone that seemed to drink the light, not because of the shadows that crept along every corridor, but because something inside her had finally shattered. She stood in the alcove outside the throne room, close enough to hear the Alpha King's voice through the massive doors, far enough that his guards wouldn't notice her presence. Her hand drifted to her abdomen, still unchanged, still secret, but she could feel them. Two pulses of life, not hers, smaller, fiercer, inevitable. His sons. Their children. And through the door, Michael's voice, cold, calculated, merciless, sliced through her soul like obsidian. It was a catastrophic blunder, Mason. A moment when instinct overrode strategy. The bond snapped at the worst possible time. Grace is a war healer, nothing more. She has no bloodline, no house, no political value. Making her Luna would unravel every alliance I've spent years building. It would be a liability I cannot afford. Every word cut deeper than the last. He didn't know she carried his heirs. He didn't know the pack spirits had already marked the twins, whispering of their shadow-blessed strength, their destined power. And still he reduced her to nothing, as if months of saving his life, of healing wounds that should have killed him, meant less than a contract with Lady Ava. But Grace wasn't nothing. Not anymore. She turned from the door, refusing to let tears fall where anyone in this cursed citadel might witness her breaking. She had spent months pouring her magic into this kingdom's wounded, pulling the Alpha King himself back from death's edge, only to be discarded the moment she became inconvenient. The mate bond had ignited between them. She had felt it burn through every barrier. She had believed in it. Now she knew the truth. So she fled, with his powerful heirs growing inside her and vengeance blazing in her heart. She would disappear into the shadow woods, raise his sons in secret, and never return. Not until he paid for every word. Not until his kingdom crumbled without her. Not until he understood exactly what he had thrown away. Before we dive deeper into Grace's story, tell me, are you Team Grace or Team Second Chances? Drop a comment, and if you're hooked already, smash that subscribe button. Trust me, this story only gets more intense from here. 6 months earlier, the road to the Obsidian Citadel cut through the northern wilderness like a scar, rising through wolf-haunted forests and treacherous mountain passes, always shrouded in mist and old magic. Grace rode alone. She was a healer from the borderlands, low rank, no noble blood, no family name worth remembering. But she carried something more valuable than titles. Power that terrified even the elders who trained her. Magic that could pull souls back from the void. The citadel loomed ahead. Black spires piercing storm clouds, lightning crackling around its towers. They said the Alpha King was dying. They said no healer could save him. They said Lady Ava was already choosing her coronation gown. Grace tightened her grip on the reins. They were about to find out what a no-name healer could do. They brought Grace to the Alpha King's chambers in the dead hour before dawn, when even the guards looked exhausted from their vigil. The room reeked of blood and rot and something darker, something magical and malignant that had burrowed into his wounds and refused to let go. 3 royal healers stood against the far wall, their faces pale, their hands trembling. They had failed. Everyone knew it. Michael lay on the massive bed, unconscious, his chest barely rising. His skin had turned gray, veins darkening like poisoned rivers beneath the surface. The wound across his ribs wasn't healing. It was spreading, consuming him from the inside out. Grace didn't ask permission. She knelt beside him, pressing her palms directly against the infected flesh, and let her power surge forward. It wasn't gentle. Healing magic of this magnitude never was. The room filled with silver-blue light as she poured everything she had into him, burning out the corruption, forcing his wolf to fight back, to remember what it meant to survive. Michael's eyes snapped open mid-ritual, blazing gold with his wolf rising to the surface. He grabbed her wrist with crushing strength, his voice a growl. "What are you doing to me? Saving your life. Grace ground out, sweat dripping down her temple. So either help me or die quietly. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kill her. Then something shifted in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or respect, and his grip loosened. His wolf submitted just enough. The corruption screamed as she ripped it free, and Michael's roar shook the obsidian walls. When it was over, Grace collapsed beside the bed, gasping, her magic depleted to almost nothing. The other healers stared at her like she was something holy or horrifying. They couldn't decide which. Michael sat up slowly, running a hand over the wound that was now sealed, pink and new. He looked at her with eyes that were too sharp, too calculating. "Where did you learn that? Not are you all right?" "No thank you." Just suspicion wrapped in curiosity. "The northern border," Grace said, forcing herself to stand even though her legs shook. "Where healers learn to keep soldiers alive long enough to win wars." His gaze tracked over her, assessing. "You'll stay. Until I'm fully recovered." It wasn't a request. Grace should have refused. Should have returned to her pack, to the simple life of healing hunters and settling border disputes. But something in the way he looked at her made her wolf stir, restless and watchful. So she stayed. The days bled into weeks, then months. Grace worked on Michael in sessions that left them both drained. His damaged wolf struggling to accept the deep healing his body required. He was a brutal patient, pushing himself too hard, demanding to know the limits of her power, questioning every technique. He never asked if she was tired. Never seemed to notice when she swayed on her feet after a particularly intense session. But he watched her. Always. Grace felt his eyes on her when she mixed healing tonics in the corner of his study, when she argued with his generals about proper recovery time, when she walked the citadel corridors in the early morning before the court woke. It was the kind of attention that made her skin prickle, made her wolf pace beneath her skin. The mate bond whispered between them, faint but growing stronger. Grace tried to ignore it. Michael was an alpha king with a kingdom to protect and political alliances to maintain. She was a borderland healer with no family name, no dowry, nothing to offer but her magic. The bond was nature's cruelty, tying her to someone she could never truly have. Lady Ava made sure Grace never forgot that fact. She appeared in Michael's chambers one afternoon while Grace was checking his healing progress. Her silk gown the color of fresh blood, her smile sharp as glass. "Still here, little healer. I thought surely the king would have dismissed you by now." "He'll dismiss me when I'm no longer needed," Grace said evenly, not looking up from her work. "How fortunate for you that he's so cautious about his health." Ava moved closer to Michael, her hand trailing across his shoulder with possessive ease. "Though I'm sure you understand this is temporary. The king requires a proper Luna. Someone of noble birth. Someone who understands court politics and alliance building." Michael said nothing, his jaw tight. His eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Grace kept her hands steady as she finished the healing assessment, refusing to let Ava see the way those words burned. "The wound has sealed completely. You'll have full strength back within the week." "Good," Michael said, his voice flat. "You're dismissed." Grace left without another word, without looking back, even though she felt his gaze follow her all the way to the door. The Wolfsbane Harvest Festival arrived with the first true cold of autumn, transforming the citadel into something almost beautiful. Torches blazed along the walls, music drifted through the courtyards, and wolves from every pack gathered to celebrate the year's bounty. Grace stood at the edge of the great hall, watching the dancing, feeling completely out of place among the nobles in their fine clothes and ancient bloodlines. Then the drums shifted to the old rhythm, the primal beat that called to every wolf's instincts. The mating dance. Grace's pulse quickened as the mate bond suddenly flared to life inside her chest, no longer a whisper but a scream, demanding, undeniable. Across the hall, Michael's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing gold. The bond snapped into place between them like a physical force, loud and primal and utterly unavoidable. Every wolf in the room felt it, the sheer power of an alpha king's mate bond igniting. Michael moved through the crowd like a predator, ignoring the shocked whispers, the gasps from his court, Lady Ava's furious expression. He stopped in front of Grace, breathing hard, his control hanging by a thread. "Tell me you feel it." "I feel it," Grace whispered. He took her hand, his grip almost desperate, and led her from the hall. The court erupted in chaos behind them, but neither of them looked back. Michael pulled her through corridors and upstairs until they reached his private chambers, and the moment the door closed, he had her against the wall, his mouth on hers, fierce and claiming. The mating was everything the bond promised. Intense, overwhelming, a fusion of magic and instinct that left them both shaking. It was a ritual older than the kingdom itself, their wolves recognizing each other, accepting each other, binding themselves together in a way that couldn't be undone. And it was desperate, months of denied attraction and fighting against inevitability, finally released in a night that rewrote everything Grace thought she understood about desire and belonging. When it was over, they lay tangled together in his bed, Michael's arm heavy across her waist, his breathing finally steady. Grace felt different, transformed, like something fundamental had shifted in her very bones. "What happens now?" she whispered into the darkness. Michael's silence lasted too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "We'll figure it out." But Grace heard what he didn't say. The hesitation, the calculation already spinning behind his eyes. She closed her eyes and let herself have this one night, this one perfect moment before reality crashed back in. Just before dawn, Grace woke to a strange sensation, a new energy pulsing inside her that wasn't entirely her own. She lay very still, hardly breathing, feeling the echo of two heartbeats that shouldn't exist yet but somehow did. The spirits, usually quiet, whispered through her consciousness with unusual urgency. *2 born of the shadow and the crown. The duality that will break and remake the kingdom. Grace's hand moved to her stomach, understanding blooming with absolute certainty. Twins. She was carrying Michael's twin sons, and they were already touched by prophecy, already marked by power that would reshape everything. She turned her head to look at Michael, still sleeping beside her, his face younger and softer in the pale light. Part of her wanted to wake him, to share this impossible miracle. But something held her back. Some instinct that whispered. Wait. See what he chooses in the light of day, So Grace lay there as dawn broke over the obsidian citadel, feeling the future growing inside her, and wondered if the mate bond would be enough to overcome the weight of a crown and the ruthless demands of a kingdom built on power instead of love. If this story has held you this long, subscribing is how you help it continue. Thank you. Now back to the story. Grace woke alone in Michael's bed, the sheets still warm where he'd been. Sunlight cut through the windows in sharp angles, illuminating the obsidian walls until they gleamed like dark mirrors. The mate bond hummed inside her chest, content and settled in a way that made her wolf purr with satisfaction. Everything felt different now. Brighter, more real. She dressed slowly, her body pleasantly sore, her magic already instinctively reaching out to sense Michael somewhere in the citadel. The twins pulsed inside her, barely more than a whisper of potential life, but she could feel them growing stronger with every passing hour. Blessed, prophecy marked, his heirs. Grace needed to tell him. Before the court began their inevitable gossip, before Lady Ava could spin this into another political game. The mate bond changed everything. It had to. She made her way through the morning quiet corridors, nodding to guards who stared at her with new awareness. They knew. Everyone would know by now that the Alpha King's mate bond had snapped, that he'd claimed her in front of the entire court. Let them stare. Grace had spent months being invisible in this place, just another healer patching up their precious king. Now she was something they couldn't ignore. Michael's study was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the training grounds. Grace climbed the stairs with a strange lightness, already imagining how she'd tell him about the twins. Would he be shocked? Afraid? Happy? She couldn't quite picture Michael happy, but perhaps the mate bond would soften some of his sharp edges, help him see past duty and politics to the family they were about to build. She reached the landing outside his study and raised her hand to knock. Then stop. Voices carried through the heavy wooden door. Michael's, deep and commanding. And Mason's, his beta, speaking in low, careful tones. Grace knew she should knock. Should announce herself. But something in Michael's voice made her freeze, made her wolf's contentment drain away like water through her fingers. It was a catastrophic blunder, Mason. Michael's words were cold, clinical, completely devoid of the heat he'd shown her just hours ago. A moment when instinct overrode strategy. The bond snapped at the worst possible time. Grace's hand fell to her side. She stood perfectly still, barely breathing. "The bond is sacred," Mason said carefully. The Pax will expect me to rule with my head, not my instincts." Michael cut him off sharp and final. "Grace is a war healer, nothing more. She has no bloodline, no house, no political value whatsoever. Making her Luna would unravel every alliance I've spent years building. The Northern Pax are barely holding, the Eastern Territories are one failed harvest from rebellion, and the Western clans only respect strength backed by noble blood. What does she bring me? Healing magic and a pretty face." Each word landed like a blade between Grace's ribs. "But the mate bond," Mason tried again. "The bond is a liability I cannot afford." Michael's voice was absolute, the voice of a king pronouncing judgment. "I need Ava. Her family controls half the kingdom's trade routes and the loyalty of 12 major packs. A union with her stabilizes everything." Grace was a moment of weakness, nothing more. "We'll handle it quietly. An annulment. Generous compensation for her service. She'll return to the northern border and everyone will forget this ever happened." Grace felt something crack inside her chest, something that wasn't quite her heart but deeper, more fundamental. The mate bond stretched between them, confused and aching, trying to understand why the other half was rejecting what nature itself had chosen. "And if she's carrying," Mason started. "She won't be." Michael's certainty was brutal. "It was one night. The odds are minimal. And if by some cruel chance she is, we'll handle that privately as well. No bastards to complicate the succession. Ava's children will be my heirs. End of discussion." Grace's hand moved to her stomach, protective and instinctive. The twins pulsed inside her, small and secret and so utterly his that it made her want to scream. He was talking about them like they were problems to be handled, threats to be eliminated. His own children. Her sons. She backed away from the door on silent feet. Her healer's training keeping her breathing steady even as her vision blurred. Not here. She wouldn't break here where guards could see, where servants could whisper, where Michael might emerge and see what his words had done. Grace ran. She knew the Citadel's hidden paths, the servant corridors and forgotten passages she'd learned during months of moving through the fortress at all hours. She reached her small room in the healer's wing and started packing with mechanical precision. Clothes, herbs, coins she'd saved, the few personal items she'd brought from home. Everything fit into one travel pack. She'd never accumulated much. Never let herself believe she belonged here enough to settle in. Her hands shook as she fastened the buckles. The mate bond pulled at her, confused and hurt, trying to draw her back to Michael. Grace shoved it down, buried it under layers of anger and grief and cold, protective determination. He didn't want her. Fame. He didn't want their children. That was where he'd made his fatal mistake. She would disappear. Take the twins somewhere he could never find them, raise them far from his political games and cold calculations. Michael wanted Ava and her trade routes. He could have them. But he would never have his sons. Never know their strength or their magic. Never watch them grow into the powerful wolves they were destined to become. The shadow woods would hide them. Grace had grown up on stories of that ancient forest, the way it sheltered those who sought refuge, the way its magic confused and misdirected anyone who entered with ill intent. She would take her children there and vanish like morning mist. Grace was halfway to the Citadel's eastern gate, hood pulled low, when a figure stepped out of an alcove directly into her path. Lady Ava looked immaculate as always, her gown a deep emerald that matched her calculating eyes. Her smile was a knife's edge. "Leaving so soon, little healer? I thought you might linger, try to press your advantage." Grace kept walking. "Step aside. Did you actually think a peasant could be Luna?" Ava's voice dripped with contempt. She paced alongside Grace, matching her stride. "Did you think one night in the king's bed would change centuries of tradition? You must have known what you were. A moment of weakness. A regrettable lapse in judgment. Nothing more." Grace's jaw clenched, but she didn't slow down. The eastern gate was close now. 30 more steps. 20. "He's mine," Ava continued, her voice hardening. "He always has been. The mate bond is just nature's way of testing his resolve, and he's proven himself worthy. You were a distraction. Now you'll be forgotten. I'm sure you'll be very happy together," Grace said flatly, pushing past a group of guards who barely glanced at them. "Where are you going?" Ava demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Back to whatever border hovel you crawled out of." Grace stopped at the gate's threshold, the forest beyond dark and welcoming. She turned to face Ava fully, letting her hood fall back. The morning sun caught the silver in her eyes, the mark of her healing magic, the power Ava had always dismissed as merely useful. "You want to be Luna so badly," Grace said softly, dangerously. "You want his crown and his throne and his political games. Take them. You've earned each other." Ava's smile sharpened with triumph. "Finally, you understand your place. But understand this, Lady Ava." Grace stepped closer, and for just a moment let her wolf rise to the surface, let the prophecy-touched power that lived in her sons shine through. "You will never touch his heirs. Never. They belong to the shadows now. Try to find them, and the forest will swallow you whole." Ava's face went pale, her eyes widening. "His heirs. Your—" But Grace was already moving, striding through the gate and into the forest beyond. Behind her, she heard Ava shouting for guards, her voice shrill with fury and shock. It didn't matter. By the time they organized a search party, Grace would be miles deep into the Shadow Woods, and the ancient magic there would make sure no one from the Obsidian Citadel could ever track her. The mate bond pulled tighter as she ran, Michael's confusion bleeding through now. His wolf sensing something wrong. Grace felt the moment he began searching for her, felt his rage and panic as he realized she was gone. She welcomed it. Let him feel what she felt. Let him understand what he'd thrown away. Grace didn't stop running until the Citadel was nothing but a dark smudge on the horizon. Only then did she slow, pressing her hand to her stomach where the twins rested, safe and growing. "Just you and me now," she whispered to them. "He made his choice. We'll make our own." The Shadow Woods closed around her like a protective embrace, and Grace walked deeper into the darkness without looking back. The Shadow Woods became home in ways the Obsidian Citadel never had. Grace built their den deep in the forest's heart, where the ancient trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated and the air hummed with old magic. It was a place designed to hide, to protect, to keep two impossibly powerful children safe from a world that would destroy them the moment it learned they existed. Kale was born first, screaming with fury, his eyes already blazing gold like his father's. Torin followed minutes later, silent and watchful, his eyes shifting between gold and silver as shadow magic flickered across his tiny fists. Grace held them both and wept, not from pain but from the overwhelming knowledge that these children would reshape everything, just as the spirits had promised. 5 years passed like a held breath. Grace trained them relentlessly, teaching them to mask the power that radiated from them like heat from a forge. Kale was physical, focused, his wolf stronger than any 5-year-old should be. He could snap branches as thick as Grace's arm, could track prey through the forest with predator instincts that should have taken decades to develop. Grace taught him restraint, control, how to hide his strength behind the appearance of a normal child. Torin was different. Where Kale was force, Torin was subtlety. Shadow magic came to him as naturally as breathing, the darkness responding to his emotions, bending to his will. At 3 years old, he'd accidentally wrapped their entire den in impenetrable shadows during a nightmare. Grace had spent hours coaxing the darkness back, teaching him to keep the magic contained, hidden, waiting. "Why can't we go to the city, Mama?" Kale asked one morning, returning from a hunt with a rabbit nearly as big as he was. "Why do we have to stay here?" "Because the world isn't ready for you," Grace said, skinning the rabbit with practiced efficiency. "Because there are people who would use your power for their own gain, and others who would kill you simply for existing." "Because of our father," Torin said quietly from the corner where he sat weaving shadows into complex patterns. He was always the more intuitive one, sensing truths Grace tried to keep hidden. Grace's hands stilled. "Yes, because of your father." "Does he know about us?" Kale demanded, his young face fierce. "No, and he never will." Torin's shadows collapsed, his small face troubled. "But he's sick, Mama. Can feel it. Something's eating him from the inside." Grace's heart clenched. The mate bond, buried as deep as she could push it, still pulsed between her and Michael like a wound that wouldn't close. Sometimes she felt his pain, his confusion, the slow deterioration of his wolf. She told herself it was what he deserved. Told herself she didn't care. She was lying. "That's not our concern," Grace said firmly. "Your father made his choice. We've made ours." But Torin's words haunted her as winter approached, as the forest grew colder and the shadows deeper. Something was wrong in the wider world. Grace could feel it in the way the magic shifted, in the reports from the few traders who passed near their territory. The obsidian citadel's grip was weakening. Rogue attacks were increasing. Chaos was spreading like infection. Then, on a morning when frost glittered on every branch, Mason stumbled into their clearing and collapsed. Grace knew him immediately despite the blood and the poison darkening his veins. Michael's beta, his most loyal friend. She was already running before Kale's warning shout finished echoing through the trees. "Trackers!" Mason gasped as she reached him, his eyes wild with pain and fever. "3 of them. Following. Grace, you have to." Kale Torin inside. "Now." Grace's voice was absolute command. Her sons obeyed instantly, vanishing into the den. Grace pressed her hands to Mason's wounds, feeling the poison burning through him. Wolfsbane mixed with something darker, something designed to kill slowly and painfully. She heard the trackers before she saw them, rogues by the stench of them, mercenaries hired to do someone's dirty work. Grace's magic blazed silver blue as she poured healing into Mason, while simultaneously sending out a pulse of power that made the forest itself respond. The trees groaned, branches whipping down to entangle the trackers, roots surging up to trap their feet. By the time they broke free, Grace had her son's small daggers in hand and murder in her eyes. "Leave," she said simply. "Or die here. Your choice." The lead tracker, a scarred wolf with eyes like a snake, smiled. "The beta's bounty is worth more than our lives. You're just a bonus." Grace didn't give him time to say more. She moved like the war healer she'd once been, the protector she'd become. The fight was brutal and efficient. When it was over, 3 bodies lay cooling in the frost, and Grace stood over them breathing hard, blood on her hands and ice in her heart. "Mama!" Kale stood in the den's entrance, wide-eyed. "Help me with Mason," Grace said. "Quickly." They carried the beta inside. Grace worked for hours, burning through her magic reserves to purge the poison, to repair the damage. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about failure and duty and betrayal. When he finally woke fully, his eyes locked on Grace with something like relief. "You're alive," he breathed. "Thank the spirits." "Grace, you have to listen." "Why are rogues hunting you?" Grace demanded. "Why are you here?" Mason struggled to sit up, wincing. "Michael." "Grace, he's dying." The words hit her like a physical blow. The mate bond constricted in her chest, confirming what she didn't want to believe. "Dying," Mason repeated. "It started a year after you left. A wasting sickness. No healer can stop it, no medicine works. His wolf is deteriorating, rejecting his own body. The court physicians call it a curse. He looked at her with desperate intensity. But I know what it is. It's the mate bond. He denied it, rejected it, and now it's killing him. Grace's hands clenched into fists. He made his choice. He made the wrong choice. He knows that now. Grace, he's searched for you for 5 years. Every resource, every tracker, every ounce of power he has left. He knows he failed you. He knows he. Mason's eyes drifted to where Kale and Torrin stood watching from the shadows, and his words died. The silence stretched like breaking ice. Gods, Mason whispered. They're his. They're mine, Grace corrected sharply. He wanted nothing to do with his heirs, remember? They were a liability to be handled. Grace. Mason's voice cracked. The kingdom is falling apart. Michael is too weak to hold it together. Ava. Lady Ava has positioned herself as regent in waiting. The moment Michael dies, she'll seize control. And the first thing she'll do is purge any potential threats to her power. I'm not a threat to her. We're hidden here. Are you? Mason's gaze was pointed. I found you. Those trackers found you. How long before Ava's spies do? How long before she realizes Michael has heirs and comes for them? He struggled to his feet, swaying. Grace, I'm not here to beg you to save Michael for his sake. I'm here to tell you that if he dies, if Ava takes power, your sons will never be safe. She'll hunt them until they're dead. The only way to protect them is to claim what's rightfully theirs. To return. Grace stood frozen, every instinct screaming contradictions. Run deeper. Stay hidden. But Mason was right. She'd known it from the moment the trackers appeared. Their safety here was an illusion, borrowed time that was running out. Torrin stepped forward, his small hand finding Grace's. His eyes were silver now, full of shadows and knowing. He's hollow, Mama. Empty where we should be. I can feel it across the distance. He's breaking. Good, Grace said, but the word tasted like ash. No. Torrin's voice was surprisingly firm for a 5-year-old. Not good. His breaking is breaking everything else. The kingdom. Pax. The balance. We have to go. Kale nodded. His young face set with determination that was pure Michael. We're strong enough now, Mama. We can protect you. Grace looked at her sons, these impossible, powerful children who were wise beyond their years. Then she looked at Mason, who waited with patient desperation. Finally she looked inward to the mate bond she tried so hard to sever, feeling Michael's pain echoing through it like a dying heartbeat. She wasn't going back for Michael. She wasn't going back to forgive him or save him or give him what he didn't deserve. She was going back because Ava would never stop hunting her children. Because the throne and the power and the legitimacy they needed to survive could only be claimed at the Obsidian Citadel. She was going back to take what should have been hers 5 years ago. We leave at dawn, Grace said quietly. Prepare yourselves. We're going to war. Torrin smiled, shadows dancing across his fingers. Kale's eyes blazed gold with anticipation. And somewhere, far to the south, Grace felt Michael's wolf stir as if sensing that everything was about to change. The Obsidian Citadel looked exactly as Grace remembered it. All dark spires and sharp edges and absolute power carved into volcanic glass. But as she rode through the gates with Kale on one side and Torrin on the other, she saw the cracks. The guards were fewer, their formations sloppy. The walls showed signs of neglect. The whole fortress felt diminished, weakened, like a predator slowly dying of starvation. The courtyard fell silent as they dismounted. Every eye fixed on Grace first, the healer who'd vanished 5 years ago, then shifted to the children flanking her. Even at 5 years old, Kale and Torrin radiated power. Kale stood with his father's bearing, chin up, eyes blazing gold. Torrin was quieter but no less commanding, shadows flickering at the edges of his small frame like living things. Mason had sent word ahead. The court knew to expect her. What they hadn't expected were the sons. Grace felt the shock ripple through the assembled nobles like a physical wave. She heard the whispers starting, saw the calculations happening behind careful eyes. 2 boys the right age, bearing the unmistakable mark of royal blood. The Alpha King's hidden heirs. Lady Ava stood on the steps leading to the throne room, her face a mask of composure that couldn't quite hide the fury burning beneath. She wore black silk and rubies, dressed like a queen already. But when her gaze landed on Kale and Torin, something flickered across her expression that looked almost like fear. "Grace." Ava's voice carried across the courtyard, cold and controlled. "How unexpected. We heard you'd found peace in obscurity." "I found purpose," Grace corrected, moving forward with her sons. "Where is Michael?" "The king is indisposed. I'm managing the kingdom's affairs in his stead." Ava descended the steps slowly, her eyes never leaving the children. "Who are these?" Grace smiled, sharp as broken glass. "His heirs. Kale and Torin. Your new princes." The courtyard erupted in chaos. Nobles shouting, guards moving forward, Mason pushing through the crowd to intercept anyone who might threaten the children. Ava's composure finally cracked, her face going pale with rage. "You dare bring bastards? Careful." Grace's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Question their legitimacy and you question the mate bond itself. Every wolf here felt it snap 5 years ago. They know these are Michael's true sons." She looked around at the assembled court. "Or would you prefer to explain to the Pax why you denied the Alpha King's destined heirs?" Ava's mouth compressed into a thin line. "Michael will decide this. Not you." "Then take me to him." The silence that followed was answer enough. Ava didn't want Grace anywhere near Michael, which meant Mason was right. Michael was dying, and Ava was already counting the moments until she could claim his throne. "Now," Grace said softly, dangerously. "Or I'll find him myself." Mason stepped forward, his hand on his sword. "I'll escort them to the king's chambers. By his order." Ava looked like she wanted to argue, but the court was watching, the guards were uncertain, and Grace stood there with 2 impossibly powerful children who were making shadows dance across the courtyard stones without even trying. After a long moment, Ava stepped aside. "This isn't over," she murmured as Grace passed. "No," Grace agreed. "It's barely begun." Michael's chambers were dark, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The room smelled of sickness and medicine and decay. Grace's healer instincts took over immediately, cataloging symptoms, assessing damage. The mate bond, so long buried, suddenly blazed to life, and she felt everything. His pain, his weakness, the way his wolf was slowly tearing itself apart from the inside. He lay in the massive bed that had once held them both, and Grace barely recognized him. Michael had always been powerful, commanding, larger than life. Now he looked diminished, his skin gray, his breathing shallow. The Alpha King reduced to a dying shadow. "Mama," Kale whispered, his young face stricken. "He's really sick." "I know." Grace moved to the bedside, her hands already glowing with healing magic. "Stay back. This will be intense." She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for him to wake. Grace placed her palms against his chest and let her power surge forward, burning through the sickness, forcing his wolf to respond. The mate bond amplified everything, her magic sinking deeper than it ever could with any other patient. Michael's eyes flew open, blazing gold even in his weakened state. He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his voice a ragged growl. "Grace, be still," she commanded. "You're dying. I'm fixing it." His gaze moved past her to where Kale and Torin stood watching, and Grace felt the exact moment recognition hit him. His eyes widened. His grip on her wrist went slack. "No," he breathed. "They can't be. Yours." Grace's voice was ice. "They are. 5 years old. Powerful beyond measure. Everything you threw away." The healing magic hit its peak, and Michael's body convulsed as his wolf finally began to fight back against the deterioration. Grace held him down with strength that shouldn't have been possible, months of training in the shadow woods translating to raw physical power. She burned away the sickness, repaired the damage to his wolf, forced the mate bond to stabilize. When it was over, Michael collapsed back against the pillows, gasping. Color was already returning to his face, strength flowing back into his limbs. But his eyes remained fixed on the children, shock and something that might have been grief warring across his features. "I searched for you," he said hoarsely. 5 years. Every day. You should have thought of that before you called me a catastrophic blunder. Grace pulled her hands back, her magic depleted but satisfied. He would live. Unfortunately. Michael tried to sit up, swayed, and she pushed him back down with more force than necessary. "Don't. You're healed but not recovered. Any sudden movement and you'll tear everything I just repaired." "Grace." His hand caught hers and the mate bond flared between them, desperate and seeking. "I was wrong. I was so goddamned wrong about everything. Save it." Grace tried to pull away but he held on, fevered intensity in his eyes. "I was taught that a king's love is a weakness," Michael said, the words tumbling out like a confession. That duty and power were all that mattered. That the mate bond was a trap, a liability. "I chose to be a king instead of your mate. I chose politics over you. And it destroyed everything." His eyes moved to their sons again. "I destroyed everything." "Yes," Grace said coldly. "You did." Before Michael could respond, Mason burst through the door, his face urgent. "We're under attack. Rogues. At least 50 of them breaching the southern wall." Grace felt it then, the surge of violence and chaos rippling through the citadel. This wasn't random. This was planned, orchestrated, timed perfectly for when Michael was weakened and Grace had just depleted her magic. "Ava," Grace said with certainty. Michael was already forcing himself out of bed, reaching for weapons. She wouldn't. She absolutely would. Grace grabbed her sons, pulling them close. "Kill you during the chaos, blame it on the rogues, claim emergency regency. And eliminate any threats to her power." Her eyes locked with Michael's. "Like your heirs." Understanding darkened his face. "The tunnels. Get them to safety." "No." Cale's voice was firm despite his youth. "We fight." "You're 5 years old," Michael started. "We're your sons," Torin interrupted, shadows already coiling around his hands. "We're strong enough." The citadel shook as something exploded below. Screams echoed through the corridors. Grace made a split-second decision, the kind she'd made on 100 battlefields as a war healer. "Stay together," she commanded. "Michael, can you fight? Watch me." He buckled on his sword, and despite his recent sickness, despite everything, he moved like the warrior king he'd always been. They moved through the citadel as a unit, Grace and Michael falling into a fighting rhythm that was pure instinct, pure mate bond. 5 years apart and still their wolves moved in perfect synchronization. Grace saw openings before Michael exploited them. Michael protected her flanks without looking. They flowed around each other like they'd been fighting together for decades. The rogues had breached the main hall, massive wolves with murder in their eyes. Grace recognized the strategy immediately. This wasn't about conquest. This was about assassination and chaos. "They're heading for the throne room," Mason shouted, cutting down a rogue. "They want Michael exposed." A massive wolf, bigger than any Grace had seen, broke through their defensive line and charged straight at Michael. Grace moved to intercept, but 3 more rogues blocked her path. She heard Michael's roar of challenge, heard steel meeting claw, but she couldn't reach him. Then Cale moved. He was just a child, barely came up to the rogue's shoulders. But when he unleashed his power, it was like a physical wall slamming into them. Shadow energy rippled out from his small body in crushing waves, and the rogues attacking Grace were thrown back with bone-breaking force. Cale stood between his parents and their enemies, his eyes blazing gold, his power absolutely undeniable. "Stay away from my mother," he snarled with his father's authority. The massive rogue leading the attack turned its attention from Michael to Kale, seeing an easier target. It lunged, jaws open for the killing bite. Torin stepped out of the shadows behind it. His magic was different from Kale's raw force. Torin's power was subtle, insidious, terrifying. Darkness wrapped around the rogue's mind, and Grace watched its eyes go wide with terror. It started seeing things that weren't there, fighting enemies that didn't exist, trapped in a nightmare of Torin's making. The rogue leader collapsed, whimpering, its mind broken. The remaining rogues faltered, faced with two impossibly powerful children who fought with magic that shouldn't exist. Grace and Michael pressed the advantage, cutting through the confused attackers with renewed fury. Mason and the royal guards rallied, driving the rogues back. In the chaos, Grace caught sight of Lady Ava at the edge of the hall, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. Their eyes met across the battlefield. Ava had played her final hand and lost. The proof of Michael's heirs, their devastating power, the way Grace and Michael fought as true mates, all of it destroyed Ava's carefully constructed political position. Ava turned and fled into the shadows. "Let her go," Michael said, reading Grace's intention. "She's finished." The last of the rogues fell or retreated. The hall fell silent except for the wounded and the dying. Grace immediately went to work, her healing magic depleted but still functional, moving from guard to guard with practiced efficiency. Michael stood with Kale and Torin, looking down at his sons with something like awe. "That was terrifying," Torin supplied helpfully. "Impressive," Michael finished. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to their eye level. "You saved us. You saved everyone." Kale crossed his arms, suspicious. "You didn't want us." "I was a fool." Michael's voice cracked. "I was ruled by fear and pride and everything that makes a king weak. I threw away the most precious thing I'd ever been given. Both of you. Your mother. Everything that mattered." Grace felt the mate bond pulling her toward them, toward this moment of fragile healing. She resisted. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't reconciliation. This was survival. But watching Michael with their sons, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes, the way Kale and Torin were cautiously, carefully assessing their father, Grace felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe, eventually, the possibility of it. Grace found sanctuary in the Citadel's inner sanctum, the ancient chamber where the first Alpha Kings had made their oaths. It was quiet here, removed from the chaos of rebuilding, away from the whispers and stares that followed her through every corridor. The battle had ended 3 days ago. Ava had vanished, her supporters scattering like rats. The kingdom was secure. And Grace still didn't know what came next. She stood before the great window overlooking the training grounds, watching Kale and Torin spar with the royal guard. Even the seasoned warriors treated her sons with wary respect now, having witnessed their power firsthand. The twins were laughing, playing, being children for the first time in their lives without needing to hide what they were. "They're remarkable." Grace didn't turn at Michael's voice. She'd felt him approaching through the mate bond, that constant pull between them that refused to be ignored no matter how hard she tried. "They had to be," Grace said quietly. "The world I raised them in demanded it." Michael moved to stand beside her, close enough that she felt his warmth but not touching. He looked different now, fully healed, his strength restored. But something fundamental had changed in his eyes. The cold calculation was gone, replaced by something raw and honest that made Grace's chest ache. "I owe you an explanation," Michael said. "You owe me nothing. We're past that. Grace, please. Let me." He stopped, gathering himself. When he spoke again, his voice was stripped of all royal pretense. "I was 7 years old when my father took me to the border wars. I watched him make a decision, choosing duty over the mate bond. His true mate was a merchant's daughter, powerless, politically useless. He rejected her and married for alliance instead. The mate bond killed her within a year, broke her from the inside." Grace's hands clenched on the windowsill. My father told me it was necessary, Michael continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. That a king's heart is a weapon his enemies will use against him. That love makes you weak, vulnerable, controllable. He ruled for 40 years, powerful and alone, and when he died, he was surrounded by allies who didn't actually care if he lived or fell. Michael's voice cracked. I was taught that his path was the only path. That to be a good king, I had to cut away everything that made me human. So you cut me away, Grace said, finally looking at him. Yes. The word was agony. The bond snapped and I panicked. You were everything I'd been taught to fear. Powerful, important, someone who could become a liability. I told myself I was protecting the kingdom. Protecting you from the brutal world of court politics. But I was protecting myself from having to choose between the crown and my soul. He turned to face her fully. My mistake wasn't mating you, Grace. My mistake was choosing my crown over my soul. And I've paid for that choice every day since. Grace wanted to stay cold, to hold on to her anger like armor. But the mate bond betrayed her, showing her his truth, his regret, the 5 years he'd spent searching and suffering. She felt the edges of her fury beginning to soften, and it terrified her. You broke me, she whispered. I stood outside your door and heard you reduce our bond to a political calculation. You talked about our children like they were problems to be solved, threats to be eliminated. Do you understand what that did to me? No. Michael's honesty was brutal. I can't possibly understand. But I know I have no right to your forgiveness. No claim to your heart. You would be justified in leaving, in taking our sons and returning to the Shadow Woods. I wouldn't stop you. Grace studied him, this powerful king who'd ruled through fear and control, now standing before her completely stripped of defenses. Then why are you here? Because I love you. The words were simple, devastating. Not as a king seeking an alliance. Not as a wolf responding to instinct. I love you, Grace. The woman who saved my life, who bore my sons in exile, who raised them to be strong and kind despite having every reason to teach them hatred. I love you, and I don't deserve you, but I'm begging for the chance to spend the rest of my life proving I can be the mate you deserved from the beginning. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the twins' laughter filtering through the window. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, years of pain and anger and buried hope warring inside her chest. I don't trust you, she said finally. I know. I don't forgive you. I know. But I never stopped. Her voice broke. The bond wouldn't let me stop. Michael closed the distance between them in 2 steps, his hands cupping her face with desperate gentleness. I know. God's grace, I know. Felt it too. Every day. Every moment. You were carved into my soul and I tried to cut you out, and it nearly destroyed us both. Grace let herself lean into him, just slightly, feeling the solid strength of him, the way their wolves immediately settled in each other's presence. If we do this, if we try, I need time. I need proof. Words are easy, Michael. I need to see the change. Then watch me. He pressed his forehead to hers, and the mate bond hummed between them, tentative but hopeful. Every day for the rest of our lives. Watch me be the mate and father I should have been. Grace pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Our sons deserve a father who chooses them over politics. They'll have one. I deserve a mate who sees me as an equal, not a liability. You'll have one. And if you ever put this crown above our family again, I'll deserve whatever you do to me, Michael finished. Grace, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance. Let me earn you back. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the decision settle into her bones. This wasn't about forgetting what he'd done. It was about choosing what came next. For herself. For their sons. For the possibility of the family they could become. One chance, she whispered. Don't waste it. Michael kissed her then, soft and reverent, like she was something precious he'd thought lost forever. The mate bond blazed between them, and for the first time in 5 years, Grace let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could heal what had been broken. The throne room had never held so many wolves. Every major pack, every noble house, every warrior who could travel had descended on the obsidian citadel for the king's announcement. Speculation ran wild. Some said Michael would name his heir. Others whispered about war preparations. No one knew the truth except those who'd witnessed the battle. Grace stood in the antechamber with Kale and Torin, adjusting their formal clothes while trying to calm her own racing heart. Mason had explained the protocol, the ceremony, what would be expected. It all felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Torin asked, his intuitive eyes reading her too easily. "Terrified," Grace admitted. "Don't be." Kale stood straight, looking so much like his father it hurt. "You're the strongest person we know. They should be terrified of you." Grace laughed despite her nerves, pulling both boys into a fierce hug. "When did you two become so wise?" "We learned from you," they said in unison. The doors opened. Mason appeared, his formal uniform immaculate. "It's time." Grace took a deep breath and walked forward, her sons flanking her. They emerged onto the dais where Michael waited on the throne, and the crowd's roar of speculation died into shocked silence. Every eye fixed on the three of them, noting the children's resemblance to the king, the way Grace moved with confidence and power. Michael rose from the throne and descended the steps to meet them at eye level, a gesture that sent ripples through the watching nobles. Kings didn't descend. Kings waited to be approached. But Michael had never looked more like a king than he did in that moment, standing with his mate and his sons, ready to claim them before his entire kingdom. 5 years ago, Michael's voice carried through the throne room, I made a choice that nearly destroyed everything. I put politics above truth, power above love. I rejected the mate bond because I believed a king had to rule with his head and not his heart. He paused, letting the words sink in. I was wrong. The silence was absolute. Grace came to this citadel as a healer and saved my life through magic and strength that surpassed every royal physician. The mate bond snapped between us as the gods intended, and I denied it. I denied her. I told her she was a mistake, a liability, politically worthless. Michael's voice roughened with emotion. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. He turned to Grace, and she saw everything in his eyes. Regret, love, determination. Grace bore my sons in exile, raised them in hiding, taught them to be strong and honorable despite having every reason to teach them vengeance. She returned not seeking forgiveness, but claiming the destiny that was always rightfully hers and theirs. Michael raised his voice, addressing the entire court. Lady Ava has been stripped of all titles and exiled for treason. Her orchestrated attack on this citadel proved what she truly valued: power at any cost. She will not be welcomed in any territory under my protection. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked relieved, others calculating. But more importantly, Michael continued, I stand before you to correct my greatest failure. He took Grace's hand, the mate bond visible now as a silver light that flickered between them. I present to you Grace, my true mate, destined by the gods and chosen by my heart. She will be Luna of this kingdom, equal in authority, unmatched in power. The crowd erupted, some in approval, others in protest. Michael waited for silence, his authority absolute. And these, he gestured to Kale and Torin, who stood tall and proud despite their youth, are my sons and heirs. Kale and Torin, born of the mate bond, blessed by shadow magic, proven in battle. They saved this citadel when rogues attacked. They are the future of this kingdom. Michael looked directly at the most powerful pack leaders, his voice carrying weight of absolute command. Anyone who questions their legitimacy questions the mate bond itself. Anyone who threatens them threatens me. They are my heirs, recognized and protected by law and by blood. The throne room fell silent as Michael dropped to one knee before Grace, shocking every noble present. Kings didn't kneel. Ever. Grace, he said clearly, will you accept me? Will you stand beside me, not as a subject but as an equal? Will you be my Luna and help me rule this kingdom with the strength and wisdom you've already proven? Grace looked out at the assembled court, at the shocked faces and calculating expressions. Then she looked at Michael, kneeling before her, offering everything he'd once denied. She looked at her sons, who watched with hope and pride. This was her choice, her destiny. Not because of the mate bond but because she chose to claim it. "I will," Grace said clearly. "On the condition that this kingdom remembers. The mate bond is sacred. Power built on rejecting truth will always crumble. And anyone who threatens my children will face a war they cannot win." The throne room erupted in cheers. Not universal, some nobles looked furious, but enough. The major packs roared their acceptance, recognizing the wisdom in honoring the mate bond, seeing the power in the young heirs. Michael rose and pulled Grace into his arms, kissing her before the entire kingdom. The mate bond blazed between them, visible and undeniable, and Grace felt something inside her finally settle. This was right. This was earned. The mating ceremony happened at dawn 3 days later, simple and profound. No elaborate court politics, no performative displays. Just Grace and Michael in the sacred grove outside the citadel, witnessed by their sons and Mason and the pack elders. They spoke the ancient vows, reopening the mate bond completely, letting it heal and strengthen. Michael marked her throat with his bite, and Grace marked him in return, the bond sealing with silver light that made the forest itself seem to sigh with satisfaction. Kale and Torin watched with solemn faces, understanding the significance. When it was done, Michael knelt before his sons. "I failed you before you were born," he said quietly. "I'll spend the rest of my life making that right. I promise you both. You will always come first. Before the crown. Before politics. Before everything." Kale considered this seriously, then nodded. "Okay. But if you mess up again, Torin will trap you in a nightmare." Torin grinned. "I absolutely will." Michael laughed, gathering both boys into his arms, and Grace's heart finally, truly began to heal. 6 months passed like a dream. The obsidian citadel transformed under Grace's influence. She opened the healer's wing, trained new war healers, established councils that gave voice to lower-ranked wolves. Michael ruled with her beside him, seeking her counsel on every major decision, proving daily that he meant his vows. Kale and Torin trained with the royal guard but also learned diplomacy, strategy, the responsibilities of their position. They were children still, but children growing into their power with guidance instead of fear. Grace stood on the private balcony of their chambers, watching the twins spar in the training yard below. They were getting faster, stronger, their magic more controlled. Kale had just knocked down 3 guards at once. Torin had made shadows dance in complex patterns that left the watching soldiers speechless. "They're going to be unstoppable," Michael said, wrapping his arms around Grace from behind. His hands settled on her stomach, where new life was just beginning to show. "Like their father," Grace said, leaning back against him. "Like their mother," Michael corrected. He pressed a kiss to her neck, right over his mating mark. "How are you feeling? Strong? Tired? Happy?" Grace covered his hands with hers. "The healers confirmed it this morning." "And?" Grace smiled, turning in his arms to see his face. "A daughter." Michael's eyes blazed with emotion. Joy, wonder, love so fierce it took her breath away. "A daughter," he repeated reverently. "We should name her Olivia," Grace said. "It means peace. After everything we went through to get here. It's perfect." Michael kissed her gently. "Olivia, our daughter. The final piece of our family." Below, Kale and Torin finished their training and looked up, waving at their parents. Grace waved back, feeling the completeness of this moment settle into her bones. Her family. Her kingdom. Her mate who'd proven himself worthy of the second chance she'd given him. The obsidian citadel no longer felt cold. The shadows no longer held only threat. Grace had brought light to this fortress, and in return it had become home. Michael pulled her closer, both of them watching their sons laugh together, their daughter growing strong within her. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming back, for giving me another chance, for being stronger than my worst failures." Grace smiled, the mate bond singing between them like a promise finally kept. "Thank you for being worth it." The kingdom spread out below them, secured by strength and ruled by love earned through pain. It wasn't perfect. There would be challenges ahead, political battles, threats from those who still opposed the low-born Luna and her shadow-blessed sons. But Grace had faced worse. She'd survived betrayal, raised powerful children alone, and reclaimed a destiny that should have been hers from the beginning. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As a family, as mates, as the Alpha King and Luna who'd learned that the strongest kingdoms aren't built on power and politics, but on bonds that refuse to break even when everything else does. The sun rose over the obsidian citadel, warm and golden, and Grace stood in its light with her mate beside her and her children below. Finally, home. Thank you for joining the pack today. If this story pulled you in, make sure to subscribe and tap the moon bell so you never miss the next Alpha Destiny. And tell me in the comments, who should we follow next under the full moon?